haven't got time to go into all the story, but concurrently with being lucky and being a financial intermediary, luckily for me, the work in the random walk in the stock market was growing up concurrently. And so I had what the astronomers would have. I had data. And I had first-hand experience in predicting human behavior, which is something normally most psychologists don't get. There's a story behind it. Again, we'll leave it for another time. But I was involved in predicting the market averages, the Dow Jones, Standard & Poor's. And back in the 60s was the first time that we could handle multiple correlation with many variables. And fortunately for me, a colleague of mine was skilled. I'm not. And one evening we were talking and I was saying to him, I'm interested in predicting human behavior. He says, fine, I'll help you. He says, what human behavior? I said, well, we need data. He said, where's the data? I said, in the financial markets. What do you want to predict? Well, optimism and pessimism. Well, how are you going to measure that? Well, I think we can measure it by looking at the market averages. So we went through this, and lo and behold, our research showed that we could predict the Dow Jones 3 months ahead of time, and our initial run-through showed a statistical significance of 0.98, which is unheard of, on a variable which was 600 at the time, and the standard error was 22 points. And of course, we looked at each other and said, this is an accident. You know, it can't be real. But we noted what the prediction would be. 3 months later, it was pretty close. So here you have an oddball who really is in the money business because he wants money to be a psychologist, and really is not interested in doing things for money. So most people who would have encountered something like this would then start saying, how can I make money at it? Well, I wanted to investigate, but first of all, I wanted more confirmation. And since I knew I wasn't going to do much, I started asking people do they want it, and I became like the weatherman. So for a good period of time, Peter Caswell and myself predicted the Dow. So most people who knew me would say, what do you think the market's going to do? And I had an opinion that was different than what's in the papers. And from experience, I soon learned that if I was predicting something and it was less than 3 deviations out, I had no faith in it. But if it was 3 deviations, to give you an example, if at the beginning our Dow Jones was 600, if it predicted it was going to 700, I would be really highly confident it would go in that direction. If it was anything less than 3 deviations, just from plain empirical experience, I didn't have confidence in it. This alone was quite illuminating to me. And I thought, well, this is interesting because it was unheard of at the time. I don't know if it's unique to myself. I said, you know, we could create an index fund. All we have to do is know this information and we can beat the market. So at the time, the chartered financial analysts were just beginning. So I went to New York and decided to talk to the president and said, you know, this can be done. Who, not unlike what we're doing here, you know the business, I don't. You know science fiction, I don't. I think we can create an index fund, and here's the information we have. He said to me, Mr. Brown, go back to your university. They won't understand what you're talking about. This was the beginning of what is going on today, and the huge fortunes that are being made by the hedge fund managers. And the hedge funds would not exist if not for the birth of the normal curve, but we'll talk about that perhaps. So I had practical experience in forecasting human behavior, and I decided, how many of you are familiar with gambler's rune theory? Have you come across it at all? Gambler's rune theory is just the probability of winning in a game of chance that played perfectly, where the difference in staying power, in other words, the amount of wealth, is different among the players. And in turn, to give you an example, if, let's say you have 1,000 players, and that half of them, we'll say 2,000. 1,000 players have $9, and 1,000 players have $1. What's the probability, if you're, say you're just tossing coins at a time, betting $1, each has $1,000, and you're betting $1 at a time. What's the probability of the player with $1 coming out being a winner? We have a pairs of games going on. So we have a player with $1 playing with a player who has $9, and we have 1,000 pairs going on. So most people would think the player with $1 hasn't got a chance. But in essence, in gambler's room theory, 10% of the players will beat the richer players. So for that, is that clear? So that philosophy, since I felt that I was in a gambling casino, I meant I had to have staying power, and I had better be with a skimmer. And I studied who were the successful skimmers, and I was most impressed with Lehman Brothers, because in essence, with $20 million paid in, they were making $100 million a year at that time. I thought that was pretty good. And it so happened that the head of Lehman Brothers had written a book that had heart. So I thought I'd go down and speak to him, because this would be a good place. I didn't know if he would be interested, because I wouldn't move to New York, but nevertheless, I went down for advice. Now, unfortunately, there were two things. One, he was ill. I met him at his home, and he never did go back. And secondly, I said to him, is there anyone else in your firm that has your leanings? He was altruistic. He said, no, none of my partners. They're not interested in any of this. So the money market is really money market with very little heart. I asked him, is there anyone in the investment banking business who he could recommend that I speak to? And he said, well, maybe Sigmund Warburg in England, but I wasn't going to go to England. So I came back and I said, well, I'm going to have to form my own skimming business. I'm going to have to form my own fund. And there's a long story related to that. I had a great deal of success in forming it, only to find out that I don't fit in a bureaucracy, not only somebody else's, but one I create. And so this is all in the learning phenomenon. While this is all going on, the type of skimming fund I wanted to start was for the underdog. Partly our tax system benefits the rich, the corporations, and is against the man wanting to start a business. What costs us as an individual to start a business, $2, a major corporation likely can get away with 25 cents after taxes and government grants. And not only that, has the staff to do the necessary work. So one of the reasons for the disparity in the fact of employment and the employment problems is that the employment is supplied by the startups, by the new companies. The major corporations are always lowering employment. And this is known throughout the small business industry and all the organizations. And because of that, in a nonprofit sense, I was instrumental in starting and being associated with, and David came in, the University of Toronto Innovations Foundation, which marketed the intellectual property created at the University of Toronto, and a similar organization operated differently at the Canadian Industrial Innovation Centre at the University of Waterloo. And while this is all going on, and I wanted to create a fund that used the information I found as the basic underlying reason. So I called the company initially Endowment Capital Corporation, and the idea behind it is that I'd raise a sufficient capital that the income on the capital would be sufficient that if you came to me for money, and you gave me a verbal presentation because you really didn't have the money to sell me. You've got an idea. I could give you the money that would enable you to put together the information that you could sell me. And the idea behind it is that if you had enough of those, because very few of them would ultimately succeed, you could play it statistically. And I had to sell the investment community on this, which meant talking to them about this research that I did. And so I was constantly searching, getting confirmation, and completely frustrated. And at the time, I could only communicate to them verbally. So what we have in my history is a person who's actively in the money business, but at the same time acting as a research psychologist. And if people ask me over the years, including my parents and my children, what is it you do, I could never explain, because there was no title for what I did. And the closest would be somebody in the merchant banking arm, the development banking arm of the merchant banks in Britain. I was very lucky in what I did. The timing was there. I had to finance large corporations and large deals because they could pay me. And any surplus I had, I tried to use to help people who didn't have it. So here we have someone who is in the money game, and I don't tell them I'm a psychologist because they wouldn't listen. And I'm a psychologist, and I don't talk very much about the money business to them. The prejudices are too great. And out of that, for the most of my career until my wife died 20 years ago, I was really in the money business, financing my own research, trying to create my own fund that would give me the freedom to continue with this work. And David, fortunately, in the 70s?
1978.
For whatever, it must be in the genes, was about the only person who got it in totality. It wasn't that there weren't others. It so happens that the only two Nobel Prize winners who are psychologists, and you may know that Nobel Prizes are not given in psychology, but they were given in economics. Herbert Simon was a father of this material, but he would publish something that I'm sure everyone would read, A Case of for Skewed Distributions. It's not a best-selling title. And I may have a senior moment, will come back to me. Danny Kahneman. And other than that, if I was to continue in my interest, I'd have to go down to Carnegie Mellon. I could not afford that type of thing. But throughout it all, it became quite evident to me. And one of the things I wanted to do in psychology is I wanted to have the success in psychology that is enjoyed in physics. Could we find anything comparable to E equals mc squared, or anything that is comparable to quantum physics? And all of a sudden it occurred to me, in some respects I found it, is that there is a law of behavior in a perfect game of chance. And it meets the description of, it meets the description of a natural law. In a perfect game of chance. Ron, perhaps you could bring up that applet. David, could you help me there for a minute?
Money exchange model?
The money exchange model? Yes. What I don't know, how many of you can see this device here?
You have to lift it up.
Let me toss it down.
Which one, David? I can't.
It's wide.
While Ron is, which one?
It's Yakovenko. It may be in the same place that you found.
Ron. It's in the section of the questions.
It should be in the questions. Yeah.
What had happened